So I was eating breakfast one day when I was hit with a nagging thought. Why are St. Louis cut spare ribs $3.98 a pound at Walmart when full spare ribs are only $2.26 a pound? Yeah, most of the time my wandering thoughts tend to lead to barbecue. But anyways, this troubled me because it's very rare for me to buy full spare ribs. And with meat prices at an all-time high and me not making any money from my pitiful YouTube channel, I couldn't help but dwell on how much money I have been wasting on St. Louis cut spare ribs. Well, apparently in Central Texas, they have perfected the craft of smoking full spare ribs. And luckily for me, we live in an age where you can get information on pretty much anything via YouTube for free. So to learn the techniques and secrets of Central Texas style spare ribs, I will be following a video guide from pitmaster Mighty Joe Yim. And Texas is the barbecue capital of the world, so I expect that these are gonna be the best ribs I have ever made, unless something goes horribly wrong. So to make Central Texas style ribs, you need full pork spare ribs. As you can see, if you cut off the breastbone and the rib tips, you are left with a St. Louis cut rib, just like the ones I smoked a few weeks ago. But anyways, to start off this trim, Joe starts on the backside of these ribs. And he cuts off the skirt, the breastbone, any thin meat on the top of the rib, and then cuts off any small ribs or bones that are sticking out at the ends. Then onto the front side. Joe removes this patch of meat below where the breastbone was to expose the fat underneath it so it can get a nice bark on top of it. And then he makes sure that the rib is nice, rounded, and even. Now onto seasoning. So because this is a Texas style rib, we are doing Texas style rub, which is just salt and pepper. And Joe says one of the most important factors of the Texas style when it comes to the seasoning is that you have a nice, even coat of pepper. So I've seen a few pitmasters on YouTube do this, but to have better control of the pepper while I'm seasoning it and make sure that I have an even coat, I'm just gonna lift up the pepper shaker about 2 feet away and just sprinkle it on top. And there we go. We have our nice seasoned and evenly trimmed ribs. And that's the most important part of Joe's technique, is that these are trimmed as even as possible so it has the best chance of cooking evenly when we smoke it. But that doesn't just fall on the trim. Another important factor is how our smoker cooks. So although Joe used his offset smoker to cook his ribs, I'm using my Weber Smoky Mountain 18. Partly because Joe has been on record saying that the Weber Smoky Mountain does a pretty good job on ribs, but mostly because I picked up the smoker a few weeks ago and I just haven't had a chance to fire it up yet. So to make sure that these ribs cook evenly, we have to have an understanding of how this smoker cooks food. So the base of the Weber Smoky Mountain is the heat source, and the water pan that's under the second grate acts as a baffle that blocks the direct heat. And then the hot air travels up the sides of the Weber Smoky Mountain and out of the vent on the top. So because it operates this way, the hot spot on this cooker tends to be the outer ring of the grate. So with that in mind, I really need to watch the ribs at the end of the rack to make sure they don't get too hot and burn before the rest of the rack is finished. And in Joe's video, he does not give specific temperatures to cook the ribs. So I asked him on Instagram what he would recommend, and he said that he tries to cook them as hot as he can without curling or drying out the meat. So because I don't have much experience with ribs, I have no idea what that means. So with that said, I am cooking these ribs between 250 degrees Fahrenheit and 275 degrees Fahrenheit. Another thing I need to keep in mind is I'm cooking in like 20-degree weather right now, which can have a negative impact on this cook if I'm not careful. And I'll be honest, because I had no idea this would even be a factor until I started messaging Joe on Instagram. But when he told me it made a difference, it kind of clicked for me, because a couple of weeks ago, I smoked a pork belly in my Weber Smoky Mountain, and I was having a lot of trouble rendering the fat while I was smoking in the snow. And my theory is it may have been due to the condensation inside of my smoker. To better illustrate this, I have a story from a friend of mine. So here in the South in the summertime, it gets super humid. And although I haven't been in the South long, I've noticed that all the houses I've seen here have their air conditioning ducts under the house instead of through the ceiling like I've been used to seeing in California. So anyways, this friend of mine was unaware that one of the ducts had a massive leak in it, preventing the cool air from circulating in the house, and instead it was blowing cold air under the house. So basically the cool air was meeting the hot, humid air in the house, causing condensation in the walls, resulting in mold growing out of the outlets. So I would think that a similar effect may happen when smoking in the winter, because the cold air is cooling the metal of the lid and body of the smoker, causing the water from the wood and the meat to condense on the inside of the smoker, making it a more humid environment, which makes it harder to render fat and develop bark on the meat. So with that said, I do not want to add any more water in the smoker. So I'm not going to use my water pan, and instead I'm going to wrap it in foil to make it easier to clean later on. But this is all highly theoretical and solely based on the experiences that I've had in life, and I'm actually not sure I fully understand it myself. But based on my prior conversations with a lot of you in the comments, I know that you guys know a lot about science. So my science bros, I would really appreciate it if you could confirm or deny my observations in the comments below. So it's been about 4 hours and we are getting very close to wrapping these ribs, but the question that I have is, when do you know it's time to wrap? Well, I had the pleasure of interviewing Joe a couple of weeks ago and I asked him, what is the hardest part about getting ribs right? And this is what he had to say.
The thing that is the hardest to read is not to feel when something is done, because when it feels soft, it's done. But it's that stage in between where you decide to wrap. Because if you get that timing off, a lot of times you wash off a lot of your bark, so the color is a little bit more faint. So I would say finding multiple cues to know when your ribs is ready to go in a wrap, if you choose to do it, is the most important thing.
Although insightful, that exposes the truth that there's just no getting around. Mastering ribs or any cut of meat takes time and experience. Joe has probably cooked over 1,000 racks of ribs, so he understands the color, the texture, the bark formation, all the signs that he's looking for at each stage of the cook. But for me, I've cooked like a dozen racks of ribs in my entire life. So nailing this cook perfectly in Joe's style on the first try is like trying to buy a lottery ticket and winning the jackpot. But that doesn't mean I'm not gonna try. So I am familiar with a few tricks to know if the ribs are ready to wrap, which include checking the fat under where the breastbone was to see if it's completely rendered, looking at the color and giving it a light tap with my fingernail to make sure the crust is set. And finally, I'm gonna use a new trick that I learned from Joe's video called the squish test. Basically, you just grab the rib by the rib tip and squeeze it right where the rib tip and the bones meet. And if it makes a squish noise, then it's ready to wrap. So for this cook, I am using Ray's no sugar added sauce, which I actually mentioned in last week's video where I gave some tips on how to use barbecue to lose weight. But I love this sauce because it tastes great just like Sweet Baby Ray's, but it's only 15 calories per 2 tablespoons. So Joe uses foil for his wrap and applies the barbecue sauce directly to the foil and puts the meat side in the sauce. He uses apple cider vinegar to thin out his barbecue sauce because if the sauce is too thick, it can kind of get leathery and plastic looking once the sauce reduces in the wrap. He also says to make sure the wrap is super tight because you do not want steam to escape and discolor these ribs. And then these ribs are going back on the cooker for a half an hour to an hour and then they'll be ready to eat. But before we get into the main event, I need to make a quick public service announcement. So do you remember the breastbone and the rest of the trimmings that I took off of the rack of ribs? Well, if you're following along at home, I hope you did not throw them away because I certainly did not. I've actually been cooking these trimmings on the side this entire time and you have to see how these look. Man, like look at the fat. It's just completely rendered on that wrap. And that's all that's left. So the ribs are done and we know this because of the feel of the rib tips. Joe describes once the rib tips are soft and pillowy like the point end of a brisket, you know it's ready. And I think this rule applies because the rib tips are the last part of the rib to break down. So if the rib tips are ready, then the rest of the ribs are ready. But anyways, let's go ahead and get these opened up and sliced so we can see how they turned out. I really like the color of the ends of the ribs, but the middle is kind of pale in comparison. And I am absolutely butchering the heck out of these ribs. I have no idea what I'm doing right now. The rib tips are just falling apart while I'm cutting them. I think I cooked these for a little bit too long. And also when I wrapped, I put the ribs face down on the grill and I probably should have put them face up to try to save some of the bark. So just based on the presentation and the things that I'm seeing from these ribs off the bat, I'd give myself probably a 5.5 out of 10 on how I cook these ribs. But I'm excited to use all the things I learned from the mistakes I made in this cook the next time I cook ribs. But even though I overcook these, I know that these are still gonna taste really good. So let's see if I'm right. Those rib tips are insane. I am never doing St. Louis cut again. So thanks Joe for sharing your knowledge with all of us, and I hope you guys give these techniques a try because I've added so many new things to my bag of tricks. Just like when I tried pork lard spare ribs on my offset smoker in the video that's on your screen right now.